In the hot summer of June in 2009, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East was shifting rapidly as US and NATO forces initiated a massive surge into the rugged, dusty terrains of Afghanistan. Thousands of troops were being deployed into highly hostile territories, preparing for what was expected to be a massive, decisive offensive against the Taliban forces. It was during the peak of this intense troop escalation that a very small, tightly knit team of only 8 United States Marines received their official orders. Their critical mission was to travel deep into the volatile Helmand province to a remote location known as an observation post, or simply an OP. This particular outpost was currently being manned by a group of British soldiers who were eagerly awaiting their relief. In the military, an observation post is a strategically placed position used to watch enemy movements, gather intelligence, and protect the surrounding area. Naturally, because of their tactical value, almost all observation posts are located on the highest ground available, giving the soldiers a clear, unobstructed view of the surrounding landscape. However, the high ground also meant that these outposts were prime targets for constant, relentless enemy attacks. But the problem was, the specific observation post these 8 Marines were heading to, which was known as OP Rock, was uniquely dangerous. It was built in a location that was strategically vital, yet it did not actually possess the high ground. Instead, OP Rock was situated in a low-lying area, surrounded on almost all sides by massive, towering mountain ridges. This meant that the soldiers inside the post were completely vulnerable. If a Marine poked his head up over the perimeter for even a second too long, they ran the very real risk of being shot by a hidden Taliban sniper hiding on the mountain slopes above them. OP Rock was an incredibly isolated, hostile, and terrifyingly small place to be. It had virtually none of the basic amenities you would expect on a military base. There were no real buildings, no air conditioning, and no showers. The entire outpost was constructed out of HESCO barriers, which are large, heavy wire mesh baskets lined with thick fabric and filled with tons of compacted dirt and sand to stop incoming bullets. For shelter, the Marines had nothing but a few ghillie tents stretched overhead and some basic sleeping pads laid directly onto the hard, rocky ground. They were scheduled to be stationed at this tiny, desolate wasteland in the middle of nowhere for 60 straight days, completely cut off from the rest of the world. This small team of 8 Marines was led by an experienced leader named Sergeant Green, and his second-in-command was a reliable leader named Corporal Lena. The other 6 junior Marines who made up the rest of the squad were Zolik, Hoy, Wilson, Parker, Smith, and Gibbs. To get to OP Rock, the team had to drive their heavily armored military vehicles through a treacherous, winding mountain pass, kicking up thick clouds of dust as they navigated the narrow dirt roads. When they finally arrived at the outpost, they found the British soldiers anxiously waiting for them. Normally, when one military unit relieves another, they perform a highly coordinated transition process called turnover operations. This involves going out on joint presence patrols, walking the local area together, and sharing vital intelligence. The departing soldiers would point out areas where they suspected improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, were buried or indicate which spots were in plain view of enemy snipers. But when these Marines arrived, the British soldiers were in an absolute hurry to leave. They completely bypassed the standard turnover operations. They looked entirely weathered, physically beaten down, and emotionally ragged, as if they had been fighting a brutal war at OP Rock for decades, even though they had only been stationed there for 60 days, the exact same amount of time that the Marines were about to spend there. As the British soldiers were frantically loading their gear to depart, one of them stopped, turned to the Marines, and said a very strange thing. He told them that if they dug anything up while they were there, they should just put it back. The Marines looked at him in total confusion, asking what he meant by that, but the British soldier refused to elaborate. He simply repeated the warning, telling them to trust him, and then he left. That night, the 8 Marines settled into their new, cramped home, trying to get some rest. On any military base in a war zone, there is a strict schedule where someone must always be manning the guard post to watch for enemy threats. On this very first night, it happened to be Corporal Lena's turn to stand watch. He climbed up into the elevated guard tower, looking out into the pitch-black darkness. It is hard to truly understand what it feels like to be in that position unless you have experienced it. You are standing in a tiny wooden shack, surrounded by a vast, empty, mountainous desert with no towns, no lights, and no signs of life. Yet, at the same time, you are completely exposed to enemies who are watching from the darkness, waiting for an opportunity to kill you. It is just you and 7 of your sleeping brothers, completely isolated. Your only lifeline to the outside world is a single military radio, and if an attack happens, you have to hope that the signal goes through to the main base and that reinforcements can arrive before you are completely overrun. There are countless stories of small, remote outposts being suddenly ambushed and completely wiped out by overwhelming enemy forces. It was a deeply eerie, tense, and silent night as Corporal Lena stood there, scanning the horizon. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a sharp, crackling sound coming from the military radio sitting right next to him. These military radios, while highly durable and reliable, were based on designs from the 1950s, and they were prone to occasional static and technical glitches. Lena noticed the static, but he did not think much of it at first. But then the crackling picked up again, becoming louder and more persistent. This time, Lena could hear a faint, distorted voice speaking through the static. It did not sound like English, and it did not even sound like distinct words at first. Concerned that his radio might be failing, Lena decided to troubleshoot. He disconnected the heavy battery, blew off any dust, reconnected it, and rebooted the system. He placed the radio back down and kept a close eye on it. A few minutes later, the static returned, but this time the voice was incredibly clear. To Lena's absolute shock, the voice on the radio was speaking in Russian. This was mathematically and technologically impossible. These military radios used highly advanced, heavily encrypted signals. You do not just pick up random, stray radio transmissions from local civilians or foreign entities. The only way to hear a voice on this specific frequency was if the person transmitting was using a military radio programmed with the exact same encryption keys. Furthermore, Lena could look directly down into the tiny camp and clearly count all 7 of his fellow Marines. They were all fast asleep on the ground. None of them were on a radio. Perplexed and starting to feel uneasy, Corporal Lena picked up his hand mic and called back to the main base, which was located miles away. He asked the watch officer if anyone was currently transmitting traffic or testing the communications lines out toward OP Rock. Almost immediately, the operator at the main base radioed back and confirmed that they were not pushing or receiving any radio traffic. Lena tried to convince himself that it was just a strange technical anomaly, but the bizarre crackling, static, and low, gurgling Russian voices continued to play through his radio speaker for the rest of his shift. When morning finally arrived and his relief came up to the guard tower, Lena handed over the post and advised the next Marine to swap out the radio because it was acting incredibly strange. Lena went down to the camp to join the rest of his squad, who were now waking up and beginning their first full day at OP Rock. Since they were stuck in this tiny outpost with no active patrols scheduled, the Marines decided to spend their day improving their physical defenses. They noticed that there was a shallow trench dug along the inside perimeter of the outpost, running right up against the HESCO barriers. This trench was designed to allow the Marines to move quickly from one side of the camp to the other without exposing their upper bodies to the snipers on the mountains. However, as they looked closely at the trench, they realized it was far too shallow, measuring only about 2 feet deep. If they had to run through it during an active firefight, they would still be completely exposed from the waist up. They wondered why the British soldiers, who had been there for 2 entire months, had never bothered to dig the trench to a safer depth. Sergeant Green and Corporal Lena decided that the squad would spend the afternoon digging the trench deeper and wider. The Marines grabbed their shovels and began to dig into the hard, dry Afghan soil. After about an hour of heavy physical labor, Corporal Lena's shovel struck something hard and metallic deep in the dirt. He reached down, cleared away the loose soil, and pulled out a long, rusted metal stake. As he brushed off the dirt, he noticed foreign letters stamped into the metal. It was Cyrillic Russian writing. He showed it to the other Marines, and they reasoned that it was not that unusual. Back in the 1980s, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, and Soviet soldiers had occupied many of these same mountain positions. It made sense that they would have left some of their engineering gear behind, which had eventually become buried under the sand. But then, about 10 meters away, a young Marine named Wilson was digging his section of the trench when his shovel suddenly broke through a soft pocket in the soil. A small cavern opened up in the dirt, and as Wilson looked inside, he saw several pieces of old broken pottery and ceramic plates. He reached in to pull the artifacts out, but as he cleared away more dirt, his hand brushed against something large, smooth, and heavy. He pulled it out, and the entire squad stopped working to stare in silence. It was a massive, perfectly preserved human femur, a thigh bone. The Marines were stunned. They stood there, looking at the bone, unsure of what to do. They ultimately decided to gently place the human thigh bone back into the dirt cavity where they had found it, and they agreed to stop digging in that specific section of the trench. They moved to a different part of the perimeter and resumed their digging. But within minutes, another Marine's shovel struck something hard. They cleared the dirt away and found more bones. No matter where they dug along the perimeter of the trench, they could not go more than a few inches without unearthing dozens of human skeletons, skull fragments, and ribs. The entire ground beneath OP Rock was literally a massive, shallow mass grave. Suddenly, the strange, ominous warning from the departing British soldier made perfect, chilling sense. If you dig anything up here, just put it back. The Marines carefully replaced all the bones they had uncovered, filled the trenches back in to their original shallow depth, and decided they would absolutely not be doing any more digging at OP Rock. Over the next 2 weeks, a heavy, creepy atmosphere settled over the outpost. The Marines tried to go about their daily routines, but they could not shake the feeling that they were living on top of a graveyard. On their 13th day at the post, a 20-year-old Marine named Hoy was assigned to the night watch in the guard tower. As he sat in the small wooden shack looking out into the vast, dark desert, he suddenly felt an incredibly intense, freezing sensation wash over him. It was accompanied by an overwhelming, highly uncomfortable feeling that someone was standing directly behind him in the tiny shack, staring at the back of his neck. Hoy slowly turned around to look, but there was absolutely no one there. The small camp below him was completely still. He turned back around to face the perimeter, and just as he did, a horrific, blood-curdling scream ripped through the silent night air. The scream came from somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the protective concertina wire. Hoy immediately raised his rifle, looking through his night vision goggles, scanning the dark desert landscape for any movement. A few hundred meters away, near a patch of desert scrub, he spotted the silhouette of a man running incredibly fast from one bush to another. Because they were in an active war zone, Hoy immediately assumed this was a Taliban fighter attempting to probe their defenses or set up an attack. The horrific scream had also woken up the rest of the Marines in the camp below. They scrambled out of their sleeping bags, grabbed their weapons, and looked up at Hoy, asking what was happening. Hoy yelled down to them, reporting that he had a visual on an enemy fighter about 200 meters out, moving rapidly from right to left. Corporal Lena ran up to the perimeter wall, raised his rifle, and looked through his highly advanced thermal imaging scope. The thermal scope was designed to detect body heat, meaning any living human or animal out in the cold desert night would light up like a bright white beacon. But as Lena scanned the exact area Hoy was pointing to, he saw absolutely nothing. The screen was completely blank and cold. There were no heat signatures from humans, animals, or even warm rocks. Lena yelled back to Hoy, asking for the exact location of the target. Hoy insisted that the man was right there, hiding directly behind a specific bush. But through the thermal scope, the bush was completely dark and cold. There was no one there. To make things even stranger, the Marines had inherited a mixed-breed dog from the British soldiers. Her name was Ugly Betty, and the Marines absolutely adored her. She was an incredibly smart animal and served as an excellent early warning system because she could always sense when local Afghans or Taliban fighters were approaching the outpost. During this entire commotion, Ugly Betty had run to the edge of the HESCO barriers, looking directly at the exact bush Hoy was describing. Her fur was standing completely on end, and she was barking and growling with an absolute terrifying ferocity. No matter how much the Marines tried to quiet her down, Ugly Betty remained completely transfixed on the empty desert, growling into the darkness. The Marines spent the rest of the night in a state of high alert, weapons loaded, expecting a coordinated Taliban attack at any moment. But the attack never came, and when the sun finally rose, the desert was completely empty. They tried to brush the incident off as a strange false alarm, but the tension in the camp was palpable. 2 weeks later, on their 26th day at OP Rock, a young Marine named Zolik was standing watch in the guard tower. It was an incredibly hot, stifling summer night, and Zolik was sweating so profusely that he actually took off his heavy ballistic helmet just to get some air. As he stood there, staring out into the empty desert, the air temperature inside the tiny wooden guard shack suddenly plummeted. It did not just cool down, it became freezing cold, so cold that Zolik began to shiver. There was no wind, and there was no logical meteorological explanation for such a drastic, instantaneous drop in temperature. Along with the freezing cold, Zolik felt a powerful, heavy presence materialize right behind him. He spun around, expecting to see one of his squad mates climbing up the ladder to play a prank on him, but the ladder was empty. He turned back around, his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, Zolik began to hear faint, raspy whispering coming from the empty air right next to his ear. The voices were not coming from his radio, they were physically inside the shack with him. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that he was just hearing things. But then, he heard the distinct, heavy sound of boots walking across the wooden roof directly above his head. Now convinced that one of his friends, a known jokester named Smith, was climbing around on the roof to scare him, Zolik stepped out of the guard shack and looked up. But the roof was completely empty. He shone his flashlight around the perimeter of the tower, but there was no one there. He looked down into the camp, and all 7 of his squad mates were fast asleep on their ground pads. Spooked and deeply unsettled, Zolik climbed back into the shack and raised his rifle, looking through his thermal imaging scope to scan the outer perimeter. As he swept the scope across the desert, he froze. A few hundred meters away, standing in the middle of the open desert under the bright moonlight, was the thermal silhouette of a man. The figure was standing completely still, with one fist raised high in the air in a strange, defiant gesture. Zolik was so startled by the bizarre posture of the figure that he actually lowered his rifle to look with his naked eyes. The moonlight was incredibly bright, and the desert was wide open, but when Zolik looked with his own eyes, he saw nothing but empty sand. He quickly raised his rifle again and looked through the thermal scope. The figure was completely gone. Zolik was deeply distressed. He was already feeling the immense weight of deployment, experiencing severe combat fatigue, and feeling isolated. He began to convince himself that he was simply losing his mind, hallucinating from the sheer stress of being stuck at OP Rock. Instead of reporting the sighting to his squad mates and risking their ridicule, he decided to keep it to himself. He sat in the corner of the guard shack, covering his ears as the faint whispering and the heavy footsteps on the roof continued until the sun finally came up. The next morning, physically exhausted and emotionally broken, Zolik went to his leaders, Sergeant Green and Corporal Lena. He confessed everything that had happened, admitting that he was hearing voices, seeing disappearing figures, and felt like he was losing his mind. He formally requested to be transferred off OP Rock. Green and Lena granted his request, and a military vehicle was dispatched to pick Zolik up. The other 6 junior Marines were incredibly angry and critical of Zolik's departure. They did not believe in ghosts, and they assumed Zolik was simply using the crazy card as an easy way to escape the miserable conditions of OP Rock, leaving them short-handed to defend the post. But just a few days after Zolik left, Corporal Lena was standing watch in the guard tower. The night was quiet, but suddenly Ugly Betty ran to the perimeter and began barking aggressively toward the dark mountains. Lena raised his night vision goggles and scanned the rocky slopes. A few hundred meters away, he spotted a figure standing on the mountainside. He assumed it was a Taliban scout monitoring their movements. To get a positive identification before firing, Lena switched to his thermal scope. But when he looked through the thermal, the mountainside was completely empty, no heat signature. Lena lowered the thermal scope and looked through his night vision goggles again. To his absolute horror, the figure was still there, but it was now 100 meters closer to the outpost. It had covered an impossible distance in a fraction of a second, moving silently and instantly. Lena's heart leapt into his throat. He switched back to the thermal scope, but again, the screen showed nothing but cold, empty rocks. He switched back to the night vision goggles, but the figure had vanished. Just as Lena was trying to process what he had just seen, he felt a firm, heavy hand tap him directly on his shoulder. He spun around, expecting to see his relief guard, but the tower was completely empty. He looked down into the camp, and everyone was fast asleep. Lena felt a deep wave of guilt wash over him. He realized that they had been incredibly unfair to Zolik. He was not crazy, and he was not lying. There was something deeply wrong with OP Rock. Over the next 10 days, Hoy, Smith, and Wilson would all experience the exact same terrifying anomalies while standing watch in that guard tower. They all heard the whispering, felt the freezing cold, and saw the disappearing figures. On their 59th day at OP Rock, the very day before they were scheduled to be relieved and leave the outpost forever, all of their communication systems suddenly went completely dead. Every single military radio in the camp stopped working. The squad's communications specialist, Gibbs, spent hours troubleshooting the equipment, but he could find no physical or technical reason for the failure. They had a backup satellite phone, but the signal was highly unstable and unreliable. They were now completely cut off, unable to call for help if they were attacked. They huddled in the camp, praying they could just make it through one final night. Wilson was manning the guard tower when, without warning, the deafening sound of heavy machine gun fire erupted right outside the perimeter walls. The muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, and the sound of bullets tearing through the air was incredibly loud. Wilson began screaming down to the camp, trying to identify where the enemy fire was coming from. The Marines scrambled out of their tents, grabbing their weapons and diving into the shallow trenches for cover. Corporal Lena ran up into the guard tower, grabbing Wilson and asking where the targets were. Wilson was in a state of sheer panic, yelling that he had no idea that the fire was coming from everywhere. Suddenly, the unmistakable, high-pitched whistling sound of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, cut through the noise. Lena and Wilson braced for impact as they heard the massive explosion of the RPG striking the side of their guard tower. Below them, the junior Marines were low-crawling through the trenches, weapons raised, searching the darkness for the muzzle flashes of the attackers. But they could see nothing. The gunfire was deafening, yet there were no visible enemies, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the gunfire stopped. The desert fell into an absolute, deathly silence. The Marines remained in their defensive positions for hours, weapons aimed at the darkness, waiting for the next wave of the attack. But nothing happened. When the sun finally rose, the Marines cautiously stepped out of their cover to inspect the damage. They expected to see their HESCO barriers shredded by machine gun bullets and a massive charred hole where the RPG had detonated against the tower. But to their absolute bewilderment, there was not a single bullet hole, not a single scratch, and not a single trace of an explosion anywhere on the outpost. There was no physical evidence that a massive firefight had ever taken place. Later that day, their relief arrived, and the exhausted, terrified Marines packed up their gear and left OP Rock, never to return. But the tragedy did not end there. Shortly after returning from their deployment, 3 of the 8 Marines who had survived OP Rock, Smith, Parker, and Gibbs, were all killed in separate, tragic combat incidents in different parts of Afghanistan. Their leader, Sergeant Green, was later severely injured and permanently maimed in a horrific IED blast. Corporal Lena would survive, but he remains deeply haunted by his time at the outpost. He is convinced that when they dug up those ancient human bones in the trench, they unleashed an ancient dark curse. It turns out that OP Rock had been the site of endless bloody slaughter for generations. When the Soviets invaded, they massacred the local Afghan Mujahideen fighters there. Years later, the Taliban took the post back, slaughtering the Soviet soldiers. Then coalition forces took it from the Taliban, leaving a trail of death. Dozens of men had died violent, bloody deaths on that tiny cursed strip of rock, and their restless spirits remained, trapped in a cycle of endless warfare. Years later, in the peaceful, picturesque state of Montana in 2014, another baffling and tragic mystery would unfold in the shadows of the mountains. Aaron Hedges was a 38-year-old, highly experienced outdoorsman and avid hunter. Aaron loved the wilderness, and during the hunting season, he was known to spend almost every single weekend exploring a specific, isolated mountain range known as the Crazy Mountains, or simply the Crazies. The Crazies are a highly unique geological formation in Montana, completely disconnected from the main Rocky Mountain range. They are incredibly beautiful, but they are also notoriously rugged, featuring steep, jagged cliffs, dense pine forests, and highly unpredictable weather. Aaron knew these mountains like the back of his hand. He was so comfortable in the Crazies that over the years, he had established several hidden cache points throughout the range, stocking them with heavy sleeping bags, non-perishable food, water, and survival gear. He was so familiar with the terrain that he did not even need a map to find them. He could simply look at the surrounding peaks and walk directly to his supplies. On September 3, 2014, Aaron and two of his closest friends decided to embark on a week-long hunting trip in the Crazies. Their plan was to hike deep into the backcountry and set up their base camp next to a beautiful, remote body of water called Campfire Lake. Because the area was completely inaccessible by motorized vehicles, the group utilized 2 horses and a pack mule to transport their heavy gear. Aaron loaded the majority of his personal equipment, including his sleeping bag and extra clothing, onto the pack mule. Shortly after they began their steep ascent into the mountains, the pack mule became suddenly spooked by something in the woods. The animal bolted, running wildly through the trees and scattering their expensive gear and supplies across the rugged mountainside. By the time they managed to recover the mule, much of Aaron's gear was lost or damaged. His friends offered to hike back down to retrieve more gear, but Aaron, confident in his abilities, declined. He knew he had a well-stocked cache point located just a few miles north of their planned campsite. He figured they would continue to Campfire Lake, set up camp, and he would simply use their spare gear for the first night, then hike to his cache the next day to retrieve his own sleeping bag. They arrived at Campfire Lake and set up their tents. For the first 2 days, the hunting trip went perfectly. But on the 3rd day, Aaron decided it was time to make his hike to retrieve his gear. He told his friends that he was going to hike north to his cache point, grab his sleeping bag and some extra supplies, and then return to camp by nightfall. His friends knew how experienced Aaron was, so they did not worry about him going off on his own. It was a clear, beautiful day, and the hike should have been relatively simple for someone with Aaron's extensive knowledge of the area. Aaron packed a light day pack, grabbed his rifle, and headed out into the trees. A few hours after Aaron departed, around 10 in the morning, one of his friends decided to check in on him using their 2-way radios. These radios were equipped with a unique safety feature, an LED screen that would automatically display the GPS coordinates and location of the other person whenever they transmitted a signal. When Aaron's friend keyed the mic and spoke to Aaron, the radio signal connected. But when the friend looked down at the LED screen, his heart sank. According to the GPS, instead of hiking north toward his cache point, Aaron had traveled a significant distance in the exact opposite direction, heading far to the east. When his friend asked him what was going on, Aaron's voice came through the radio, sounding slightly confused. He said that he had gotten mixed up and had somehow missed the turn to the cache point, but he was currently trying to locate the main trail to get back on track. His friends told him to be careful and advised him to turn around, expecting him to correct his path and return to camp later that evening. But this was the first incredibly bizarre detail of the case. The fork in the trail that Aaron had missed was not a subtle, hidden path. It was a massive, highly obvious split in the terrain that Aaron had walked past dozens of times. To make it even more confusing, the wrong path that Aaron took ran directly alongside a major roaring creek. The correct path to his cache went steeply uphill, away from any water source. For an expert hunter who knew these mountains intimately, walking next to a loud, obvious creek for over an hour without realizing he was on the wrong path made absolutely no logical sense. That night, Aaron did not return to the campsite. His friends grew increasingly concerned and attempted to contact him on the radio, but they received nothing but dead static. Because they were deep in the wilderness, there was absolutely no cell phone reception, and it would take them an entire day of hard hiking just to reach a location where they could contact emergency services. They decided to wait through the night, hoping Aaron had simply decided to camp at his cache point to avoid hiking in the dark. The next morning, September 6th, there was still no sign of Aaron. His friends hiked toward his cache point, calling his name and trying the radio, but the mountains were completely silent. Realizing something was terribly wrong, they packed up their camp and began the long, grueling hike back down the mountain to report Aaron missing. As soon as the report was filed, the local sheriff's department launched a massive search and rescue operation. But the unpredictable weather of the crazies struck with a brutal vengeance. Just as the search teams were deploying, a massive, historic autumn blizzard rolled into the mountains, dumping over 2 feet of heavy, wet snow within the first 12 hours. The extreme cold, near-zero visibility, and dangerous terrain severely hindered the search efforts for the first 2 days. On September 9, as the storm finally began to clear, searchers focused their efforts on the eastern trail along the creek, the area where Aaron's radio signal had last been detected. They climbed to the top of a steep cliff that overlooked the rushing creek. There, next to a large pine tree, they found something that made their jaws drop. Sitting neatly side by side on the snow-covered ground was a pair of hunting boots. They were placed so perfectly and deliberately that they looked as if they had been set there by someone preparing to go to sleep. Next to the boots was a clear, ash-covered fire pit. Inside the ashes was an empty package of cigarettes, which was Aaron's preferred brand. They also found Aaron's camelback water bladder and the heavy nylon straps of his backpack, which had been cut off and burned in the fire. But there was absolutely no sign of Aaron, and there were no footprints in the snow leading away from the site. The searchers who found the boots were deeply disturbed. They pointed out that they had been in this exact specific area over the past 2 days of the search, and the boots in the fire pit had definitely not been there. This meant that Aaron had somehow survived the freezing blizzard, built a fire, taken his boots off, and then vanished. Investigators theorized that Aaron must have been suffering from severe hypothermia. In the final stages of hypothermia, a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing often occurs, where the victim's brain misinterprets the freezing cold as an intense, burning heat, causing them to strip off their clothes and shoes before succumbing to the cold. They focused the search heavily on the immediate area around the cliff, believing that a barefoot man in 2 feet of snow could not have wandered more than a few hundred yards. But despite using search dogs, helicopters, and ground teams, they found absolutely nothing. 9 months passed, and the snow finally melted from the peaks of the crazies. In June of 2015, the Ryan family, who owned a large, beautiful ranch at the very base of the mountain range, went out to perform their annual maintenance on the miles of barbed wire fencing that bordered their property. During a break in the heavy labor, one of the family members decided to take a walk up into the public mountain land just beyond their fence line to enjoy the view. He hiked about a mile up a gentle slope, and as he stopped under a large pine tree to rest, he spotted a bright flash of color on the ground. He walked over and saw a bright orange hunter's safety vest lying in the dirt. As he looked closer, he realized there was a heavy camouflage backpack leaning neatly against the trunk of the tree, looking as if someone had just placed it there while they took a quick break. The rancher immediately contacted the authorities. When deputies opened the backpack, they found Aaron Hedges' wallet, his driver's license, a fully loaded hunting rifle, and plenty of food and water. Sitting on a flat rock right next to the backpack was an open metal thermos and an open, empty energy drink can. It looked as if Aaron had sat on the rock, enjoying a drink, while looking out at the landscape. And from that exact rock, if you looked straight down the slope, you could clearly see the Ryan family's ranch house, barn, and vehicles. It was only a mile away, a straight, easy downhill walk to absolute safety and rescue. But the most baffling detail was the location. This backpack and rifle were found over 6 miles away from the cliff where his boots had been discovered. This meant that Aaron, while completely barefoot in a freezing, 2-foot-deep blizzard, had somehow traversed 6 miles of incredibly steep, jagged, and unforgiving mountain terrain, carrying a heavy backpack and a rifle. He had walked right past the ranch, a beacon of safety, climbed up a slope, sat on a rock to have a drink, and then disappeared again. Another entire year would pass before the final piece of the mystery was found. In 2016, a pair of horseback riders were exploring the same area near where the backpack had been discovered when they spotted something white nestled in the pine needles under a tree. It was a weathered human skull. Forensic testing confirmed it belonged to Aaron Hedges. Search teams returned to the site and located the rest of his skeletal remains scattered nearby. But remarkably, his feet, the very parts of his body that should have been severely damaged or severed during a 6-mile barefoot hike in the freezing snow, were never found. The coroner examined the remains, but due to the advanced decomposition, they were completely unable to determine a cause of death. How did an expert hunter get so completely turned around on a familiar trail? Why did he take off his boots in a blizzard, walk 6 miles barefoot away from safety, and sit down to die within sight of a ranch? The mountains kept their secrets. While Aaron's tragedy occurred in the cold peaks of Montana, another chilling disappearance was destined to take place in the dense, rugged backwoods of Idaho. In the autumn of 2018, Terrence Woods was a 27-year-old, highly talented filmmaker and journalist. Terrence was a bright, ambitious young man who loved his work. Ever since graduating from college, he had traveled the world, filming documentaries and television shows in some of the most remote and dangerous locations on Earth. He had successfully completed challenging, high-pressure shoots in the rugged wilderness of Turkey and the freezing, isolated landscapes of Alaska. He was a capable, resilient professional who was well accustomed to the physical demands of outdoor production. In October of 2018, Terrence was hired by a prominent British production company called Raw TV to work on a new television series. The shoot was taking place at an abandoned historic gold mine called the Penman Mine, located deep in the dense, isolated backcountry of Idaho. Before leaving for the shoot, Terrence had sent a few text messages to his close friends expressing a strange lack of enthusiasm for the job. He mentioned that he was not really excited about the trip, but his friends did not think much of it. It sounded like typical, harmless venting about a demanding work assignment, and there was nothing in his messages to suggest he was in distress or danger. Terrence arrived in Idaho in early October, checking into his hotel and texting his father to let him know he had arrived safely. He was scheduled to be on site until mid-November, but on October 5th, Terrence sent a highly unusual text to his father. The message simply stated that he had decided to cut the trip short and would be flying back home on October 10. He provided no explanation for this sudden decision. His father immediately texted back asking why he was leaving early, but he never received a reply. Terrence had already departed for the day's shoot at the Penman Mine, which was located in a deep mountain valley with absolutely no cell phone reception. During the shoot on October 5, the production crew noticed that Terrence was acting incredibly strange. Usually energetic and talkative, Terrence was completely quiet, withdrawn, and refused to make eye contact or speak with anyone unless it was absolutely necessary. He seemed deeply distracted, as if his mind were miles away. As the sun began to set and the crew began packing up their heavy camera gear to head back to their vehicles, Terrence walked over to one of the producers and said he needed to step away to relieve himself. He walked toward the edge of a steep 15-foot cliff that bordered the clearing. For reasons he still cannot explain, the producer felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of unease. He turned his head to watch Terrence. He saw Terrence walk up to the edge of the cliff, and then, in the blink of an eye, Terrence was gone. His heavy two-way radio was sitting upright on the ground right where he had been standing. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, the producer ran to the edge of the cliff, expecting to see Terrence lying injured at the bottom of the 15-foot drop. But when the producer looked over the edge, he was met with a sight that left him completely speechless. Terrence had not fallen. He was standing at the bottom of the cliff, completely uninjured. And then, without saying a word, Terrence turned and began sprinting at absolute full speed down the steep hill, heading straight into the thick, dark pine forest. He did not look back, he did not cry out, and he did not wave his arms. He was simply running as fast as his legs could carry him, as if he were running for his very life from an invisible monster. The producer began screaming to the rest of the crew, yelling that Terrence was running away. The producer and another crew member scrambled down the cliff and began chasing after him, shouting his name. But Terrence was incredibly fast, and he quickly vanished into the dense undergrowth. The crew searched the immediate area for an hour, but as the darkness fell, they realized they were out of their depth. They drove to the nearest town and contacted the local sheriff's department. The next morning, authorities launched a massive, exhaustive search and rescue operation. They deployed search dogs, infrared-equipped helicopters, drones, and hundreds of ground searchers who combed the dense forest. But they found absolutely nothing. One of the lead search and rescue officers later commented that Terrence's complete disappearance was physically baffling. The forest floor in that specific area of Idaho was so heavily choked with decades of fallen, rotting trees that walking through it was incredibly difficult. The searchers often had to step from one fallen log to another, never actually touching the ground, just to move a few yards. The idea that a young man wearing basic production clothing and no survival gear could sprint through that treacherous, tangled terrain and completely evade a massive search grid without leaving a single footprint, a shred of clothing, or a broken branch was seemingly impossible. Yet, Terrence Woods was gone, completely swallowed by the wilderness, leaving his family with nothing but painful, unanswered questions. Sometimes the mysteries of the world are not confined to the silent, empty spaces of the wilderness. Sometimes they follow us back to civilization, invading the very places we call home. On January 23, 2005, a devastating tragedy struck the New York City Fire Department. It would come to be known in firefighting history as Black Sunday. On that freezing winter day, a massive, out-of-control fire broke out in a crowded apartment building in the Bronx. A team of firefighters, including a brave, dedicated man named Curtis Myron, became trapped on the 4th floor of the burning building. The intense flames and thick, toxic black smoke quickly cut off all of their escape routes. With the heat becoming unsurvivable, the men were faced with a horrific choice. They had to jump from the 4th floor windows. Tragically, Curtis Myron and another firefighter did not survive the fall, dying from their injuries. To make the day even more devastating, another separate fire broke out in the city later that day, claiming the life of a third firefighter. It was the single largest loss of life for the New York City Fire Department since the tragic events of September 11, 2001. Curtis's loving wife, Jeanette, and their two young daughters, Angela and Denine, were left completely heartbroken. Curtis was the rock of their family, a loving husband and a devoted father. He had physically built the beautiful house they lived in with his own two hands, and now every single corner of the home was a painful, constant reminder of their devastating loss. The Black Sunday tragedy became a major national news story, and Jeanette found her home constantly surrounded by reporters, news vans, and flashing cameras, all hoping to get an interview with the grieving family. Feeling trapped, overwhelmed by grief, and desperate for a fresh start, Jeanette made a sudden decision. She told her daughters that they were going to sell the house and move away from the city. She wanted to find a quiet, peaceful place where they could heal in private. After a brief search, Jeanette found a charming older house located on a spacious one-acre lot in a quiet neighborhood on Long Island. The price of the home was incredibly low, almost too good to be true for that much land. The house was quite old and needed a tremendous amount of physical renovation, but Jeanette saw its potential. When Curtis's firefighter brothers heard about the move, they immediately stepped forward to help. They told Jeanette that they would take care of all the renovations for free, honoring the memory of their fallen brother. Jeanette bought the house, and within weeks she and her daughters moved in. The firefighters arrived and began a massive, complete renovation of the property, tearing walls down to the studs, replacing plumbing, and rebuilding the structure from the inside out. Because of the ongoing construction, many of the doors and windows did not have secure locks, and the house felt wide open and vulnerable. Feeling uneasy about their security, Jeanette purchased 7 high-definition security cameras and installed them around the exterior of the house, configuring them to stream live video feeds directly to her laptop. She found comfort in keeping her laptop open on the kitchen counter, constantly monitoring the dark yard around her new home. One quiet night, as Jeanette was sitting on the couch watching the camera feeds on her laptop while her daughters were upstairs, she noticed something strange on the camera that pointed toward the edge of their property. The yard bordered a dense, dark forest. On the screen, Jeanette watched in silence as a tall figure, completely draped in a heavy, dark cloak, slowly emerged from the tree line. The figure walked with a slow, deliberate pace onto their gravel driveway, stopped and stood completely still, staring directly up at the house. Jeanette froze, her heart racing as she stared at the screen. After standing there for several tense minutes, the figure slowly turned around, walked back into the dark woods, and vanished. Because the camera quality was slightly grainy in the dark, Jeanette tried to convince herself that it must have been a large animal or a strange trick of the shadows. But at that exact same moment upstairs in her bedroom, teenage Angela was laying on her bed reading a book. The headboard of her bed was pushed up against the drywall. Suddenly, she heard a soft, distinct tapping sound coming from inside the wall directly behind her head. She could actually feel the vibrations of the taps through the wall. She sat up, turning to look at the drywall. Suddenly, 3 incredibly loud, heavy bangs shook the wall, as if someone were violently hitting it from the other side. Angela scrambled out of bed, ran to her door, and opened it. She looked down the stairs into the living room and saw her mother sitting calmly on the couch, looking at her laptop. She looked down the hallway and saw that her sister Denine's bedroom door was tightly shut. Angela walked back into her room, trying to calm her racing heart. She decided to put her ear against the drywall to see if she could hear any rational explanation, like water pipes rattling. But the very instant her ear made physical contact with the wall, a massive, deafening crash erupted from the exact spot she was touching, as if a sledgehammer had struck the wall from the inside. Terrified, Angela let out a scream, dove onto her bed, and pulled the heavy blankets completely over her head, shivering in fear. Meanwhile, just a few doors down the hallway, younger sister Denine was experiencing her own terror. She had been sitting at her desk when she heard 3 slow, rhythmic taps on her bedroom door. Assuming her mother had come upstairs, Denine walked over and opened the door. The hallway was completely empty and silent. She looked down the stairs and saw her mother downstairs, and she saw Angela's door was closed. Confused, Denine closed her door. The exact second the door clicked shut, 3 loud, aggressive taps shook the wood right in front of her face. Denine opened the door again, but there was absolutely no one there. Terrified, she ran to her bed, dove under the covers, and hid. The 2 girls lay in their separate rooms, listening in horror as the mysterious tapping and scraping sounds continued inside the walls for the rest of the night. The next morning, the girls met in the kitchen, and they immediately began sharing their terrifying experiences from the night before. They quickly realized they had both heard the exact same bizarre sounds at the exact same time. Jeanette walked into the kitchen and found her daughters in a state of high anxiety, talking rapidly. When she asked what was wrong, the girls told her everything, begging her to explain what was happening to their new home. Jeanette, desperate to maintain a sense of safety and normalcy for her grieving children, brushed their concerns aside. She told them that they were simply living in an old, unfamiliar house, and that the sounds were just the natural creaking of old floorboards and settling pipes. She told them they were overthinking things and promised them the house was perfectly safe. A few days later, the team of firefighters arrived to begin renovating the basement. The basement was a massive, dark space completely packed with decades of old, dusty clutter left behind by the previous owners. It was filled with rusted machinery, broken furniture, stacks of old papers, and strange, heavy boxes. The firefighters began the grueling process of hauling the heavy junk out to a dumpster. One of the firefighters, a close family friend of Curtis named Tom, was clearing away a pile of rotting wooden crates in the far corner of the basement floor. As he swept away the thick layer of dirt and dust beneath the crates, Tom froze. Painted directly onto the concrete floor was a massive, perfectly drawn pentagram, a five-pointed star enclosed within a circle, a symbol deeply associated with dark, ritualistic practices. Tom immediately called Jeanette down to the basement. He pointed to the symbol on the floor, his face serious, and asked her what she wanted them to do with it. Jeanette felt a cold wave of dread wash over her, but she quickly told Tom to grab some heavy gray paint and completely paint over it. She did not want her daughters to ever see it. But what Jeanette did not know was that her daughters had already made their own disturbing discoveries. While playing in the dense woods at the edge of their property over the past week, Angela and Denine had found dozens of pentagrams carved deep into the bark of the trees, etched onto flat boulders, and drawn into the dirt. They had decided to keep the discovery a secret, not wanting to cause their mother any more worry. A week later, Jeanette had to run some errands, leaving teenage Angela home alone for a few hours. To keep busy, Angela decided to tackle some of her household chores, starting with cleaning out the kitchen refrigerator. She stood in front of the open fridge, wiping down the plastic shelves. As she worked, she began to feel a heavy, suffocating sensation in the air, accompanied by the overwhelming feeling that someone was standing directly behind her in the empty kitchen. She repeatedly spun around, but the kitchen was completely empty. She tried to ignore the feeling, but the atmosphere became increasingly tense and heavy. Just as Angela decided to shut the fridge and run upstairs, a massive, deafening explosion of sound erupted directly behind her. She spun around and watched in absolute horror as every single cabinet door and kitchen drawer in the room violently flew open at the exact same time. Dozens of heavy ceramic plates, glass cups, heavy pots, pans, and sharp knives were violently ejected from the cabinets, flying through the air and smashing into 1,000 pieces across the hardwood floor. Angela let out a shriek, sprinted out of the kitchen, flew up the stairs to her bedroom, and curled into a tight ball in the corner of her closet, sobbing hysterically. When Jeanette returned home, she opened the front door and was met with a scene of absolute devastation. The kitchen looked as if a violent tornado had touched down inside the room, with broken glass and sharp metal covering every inch of the floor. Fearing a violent home invasion, Jeanette began screaming for Angela, racing up the stairs. She found her daughter shivering in the corner of her closet, unable to speak. Jeanette searched the entire house, but there was no sign of an intruder. She grabbed her laptop and reviewed the exterior security footage. No one had approached the house, and no one had entered. When Angela finally calmed down enough to explain what had happened, Jeanette was deeply shaken. She could see the genuine, absolute terror in her daughter's eyes. Angela was not lying, and she was not exaggerating. From that day on, Angela became deeply withdrawn, refusing to spend a single second alone in any room of the house. The physical renovations continued, and a few days later, the firefighters were tearing down a sheet of old, water-damaged drywall in the basement, near the concrete space underneath the stairs. Hidden deep inside the wall cavity, nestled between two wooden studs, they found a small, dusty bundle wrapped in delicate yellowed lace. They pulled it out and handed it to Jeanette. When Jeanette untied the lace, she found a very old, leather-bound journal. She opened the cover and saw the name Christina, along with the date 1927, the exact year the house had been built. Jeanette took the journal to her room and began carefully flipping through the fragile pages. What she read left her completely horrified. The journal was written by a young girl who had lived in the house decades ago. The entries started normally, but they quickly descended into a dark, disturbing chronicle of horrific rituals, animal sacrifices, and dark worship that had taken place inside the home. The journal contained detailed, hand-drawn diagrams of pentagrams and ritual circles, with notes indicating that these dark acts were being performed in the basement, specifically inside the small, enclosed concrete room directly beneath the basement stairs. Jeanette immediately closed the journal, hid it deep in her dresser, and resolved to never tell her daughters about its contents. But the dark energy in the house was growing stronger. A few nights later, Angela was in her bedroom, listening to music through her headphones, trying to drown out the constant creaking of the house. Suddenly, she heard a faint, distorted voice whisper her name. She took her headphones out and called out to her mother, but Jeanette replied from downstairs that she had not said anything. Angela looked down the hallway and saw the bathroom door was closed, and she could hear the sound of running water. Her sister Denine was taking a shower. Angela walked back to her bed and sat down. Before she could put her headphones back on, a loud, deep, and incredibly clear male voice whispered from the empty air right next to her, telling her to get Denine. The voice was so close that she could actually feel a cold breath on her skin. Before she could even scream, a horrific, blood-curdling shriek erupted from the bathroom down the hall. Denine was screaming in pure, unadulterated terror. Angela and Jeanette both sprinted down the hallway, bursting into the bathroom. They found Denine huddled in the fetal position on the floor of the shower, sobbing violently and pointing at the glass door. Jeanette wrapped her daughter in a towel, pulling her out of the bathroom and into her own bedroom, where they all huddled together on the bed. When Denine was finally able to speak, she told them a terrifying story. She said she had been showering when she heard a low, raspy male voice whisper her name from the other side of the curtain. She looked through the frosted glass of the shower door, and to her absolute horror, she watched as a massive, dark, and shadow-like hand slammed flat against the outside of the glass, pressing hard as if trying to break through to get to her. Jeanette felt completely helpless. She had lost her husband, and now her family was being terrorized by an unseen, malevolent force that she could neither fight nor understand. She desperately wanted to pack their bags and leave, but they were financially ruined. They had invested every single penny of Curtis's insurance money into buying and renovating this house, and they simply could not afford to move. They were completely trapped. The physical and psychological toll on the family continued to mount. Angela, terrified of the house, spent as much time as possible outdoors. One afternoon, she went out to the front yard to sit on the wooden swing set. Jeanette, constantly anxious, sat on the living room couch with her laptop, keeping a close eye on her daughter through the live security camera feed that pointed toward the swing. As Jeanette watched the screen, she saw a dark, cloaked figure slowly emerge from the thick forest at the edge of the yard. The figure crept up silently behind the swinging teenager. Jeanette let out a scream, dropped her laptop, and sprinted toward the front door. But before she could even reach the porch, she heard Angela scream in agony. Jeanette ran around the corner of the house and found her daughter lying on the grass in front of the swing, clutching her ankle, which was bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. The cloaked figure was gone. They rushed Angela to the hospital, where doctors confirmed she had severely dislocated and fractured her ankle, requiring a heavy plaster cast and crutches. When they returned home, Jeanette immediately opened her laptop and reviewed the recorded security footage. The footage was terrifyingly clear. It showed the cloaked figure walk out of the woods, stand directly behind Angela, violently push her off the swing, and then sprint back into the trees. Jeanette immediately called the local police. The officers arrived, watched the footage, and walked the wood line. But the figure was completely covered in dark fabric, making identification impossible, and they found no footprints in the thick pine needles. They advised Jeanette to keep her doors locked, stay out of the woods, and call them immediately if she saw the figure again. A few days later, Jeanette had to make a quick trip to the pharmacy to pick up Angela's prescription pain medication. Angela, unable to move easily due to her heavy leg cast, had to stay home alone in her bedroom for about an hour. She sat on her bed, trying to read, when she suddenly heard a loud, violent banging sound coming from inside her bedroom closet. The heavy wooden closet doors began to violently rattle and shake on their tracks, as if something inside were trying to claw its way out. Angela was paralyzed with fear. She knew she could not run or escape down the stairs on her crutches. In a desperate bid to hide, she slid off the bed and crawled underneath it, pressing her back flat against the wall. From her hiding spot, she had a clear, unobstructed view of the bottom of the closet door. She watched in absolute terror as the closet doors slowly, silently slid open. A horrific, overpowering smell of rotting meat and sulfur immediately filled the bedroom, making her gag. Then she saw them. Two bare, human-like feet, covered in pale gray and peeling skin, stepped out of the closet and onto her carpet. The figure was tall, dark, and shadowed. It began to slowly pace around her bedroom, its heavy, dragging footsteps sounding incredibly loud on the floorboards. Angela held her hands tightly over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, praying the entity would not look under the bed. After a few agonizing minutes, the figure slowly walked out of her bedroom and down the hallway. Angela could hear its footsteps moving down the stairs and into the living room. Then the house fell completely silent. Angela lay there, hoping the nightmare was over. But suddenly, she heard a rapid, heavy pattering sound. Something was sprinting up the stairs. The entity flew into her bedroom, running directly to the side of her bed. Angela looked out, and to her absolute, paralyzing horror, a face slowly bent down from the top of the mattress, looking directly under the bed at her. The face was a nightmare materialized. It was completely dark, with deeply sunken, hollow eyes, and its pale gray skin looked as if it were literally rotting and peeling off the bone. The entity stared directly into her eyes, upside down, baring its yellowed teeth. Angela let out a deafening, hysterical scream. The entity violently pulled back up onto the bed, and Angela could hear the springs creaking as it sat directly above her. She lay there, screaming and crying, completely trapped. 45 minutes later, Jeanette returned home. She heard her daughter's muffled screams from the driveway and came charging into the house. She ran up the stairs and pulled a hysterical, hyperventilating Angela from beneath the bed. That was the absolute breaking point. Jeanette did not care about the money, the house, or the renovations. She grabbed her daughters, put them in the car, and drove directly to her parents' house, vowing to never spend another night in that cursed home. She contacted a prominent local paranormal investigator named Liz, who agreed to perform a massive, complete spiritual cleansing of the property. Liz spent days in the house burning sage, reciting prayers, and confronting the dark energy. After the cleansing, Jeanette, facing financial ruin if they abandoned the home, made the incredibly difficult decision to return. To their immense relief, the terrifying activity had completely stopped. The air in the house felt light and clean. Jeanette, Angela, and Denine still live in that Long Island home today, finally finding the peace and sanctuary they had searched for after Curtis's tragic death. But while the Myron family was able to find a resolution to the terror in their home, another family in Southern California in 2006 would find themselves completely destroyed by a mysterious, hostile force. Susan Lewis and her teenage daughter, Jamie, had just moved into a beautiful, sunlit house in a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Southern California. It was their dream home, a quiet, peaceful space they affectionately referred to as their sanctuary. Shortly after moving in, Susan's longtime boyfriend, Matt, moved in to join them, along with his teenage daughter, Marie, who was the exact same age as Jamie. The two girls quickly became best friends, and the four of them lived as one happy, harmonious family. It was a perfect, charmed life until the day the peanut butter spilled. It was a beautiful, hot summer afternoon, and Matt, Jamie, and Marie were outside in the backyard laughing and splashing around in the swimming pool. Susan decided to step inside the house to prepare a nice lunch for everyone. She walked into the cool, quiet kitchen and stopped in her tracks. Sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter was an open jar of peanut butter. The lid was lying next to it, and the jar had been tipped onto its side. Oddly, the peanut butter inside had completely liquefied, running out of the jar and pooling across the counter and onto the floor. Susan touched the air, but the kitchen was air-conditioned and cool. She figured one of the teenagers must have come inside, put the jar in the microwave to melt it for some strange prank, and then poured it on the counter. She walked to the back door and called Jamie inside. When Jamie saw the mess, she laughed, genuinely confused, and denied having anything to do with it. Susan then called Marie inside, but Marie was equally bewildered, insisting she had been in the pool the entire time. Susan, wanting to keep the mood light, decided to let it go. She cleaned up the sticky mess, and the family spent the rest of the day enjoying the pool. But when they finally walked back into the house later that evening, they were met with a scene of absolute, incomprehensible chaos. Stacked neatly on every single step of the staircase leading to the second floor were canned goods from their pantry. In the main bathroom, shampoo bottles had been stacked perfectly on top of one another, and hairbrushes were arranged in a perfect geometric star pattern on the counter. When Susan opened the microwave, she found more canned foods, peanut butter jars, and stuffed animals stuffed inside. Underneath the kitchen sink, all of the cleaning bottles had been lined up on the floor in a perfect descending line based on their height. To make it even more disturbing, a thick, sticky liquid that looked like ketchup and shampoo had been sprayed and smeared all over the walls. The family was terrified, believing a deeply disturbed intruder had broken into their home while they were in the pool. They ran out of the house and began filming the scene on their digital cameras, documenting the bizarre arrangements. But the problem was, they had been in the backyard the entire time with a clear view of the only entrance to the property. No one could have entered the house without them seeing. Very quickly, a dark, toxic cloud of suspicion began to tear the family apart. Matt became convinced that Susan's daughter, Jamie, was performing these elaborate, destructive pranks to get attention. Susan, on the other hand, was equally convinced that Matt's daughter, Marie, was the culprit. Instead of contacting the police, which would have exposed their family to outside scrutiny, Susan and Matt began to fiercely defend their own biological children, leading to explosive, screaming arguments. They spent hours cleaning up the massive mess, trying to ignore the terrifying reality of what was happening in their home. A week passed in tense, hostile silence. Jamie and Marie were in Jamie's bedroom trying to study. Marie was sitting at the desk, and Jamie walked in carrying a mug of hot coffee. She placed the mug on the desk next to Marie and stepped out to use the bathroom. A minute later, Jamie walked back into the room. Marie was still sitting at the desk, her head down, focused on her homework. But the mug of coffee had been violently thrown across the room, splashing dark liquid all over Jamie's bed. Jamie immediately accused Marie, screaming at her for ruining her bedding. Marie looked up, genuinely shocked and terrified, insisting she had not touched the mug. Jamie, refusing to believe her, stormed out to get a bottle of bleach. She returned and placed the heavy plastic bottle on top of her tall wooden dresser. Jamie went back to the bed to pull off the wet sheets. As she did, she heard a strange plastic clicking sound. She and Marie watched in silent, freezing horror as the plastic cap of the bleach bottle on the dresser twisted off on its own, fell to the floor, and the heavy bottle tipped over, dumping bleach all over Jamie's clothes. Marie was sitting across the room, completely still. Before they could even scream, a heavy wooden picture frame fell off the bedroom wall, smashing on the floor. A second later, a second picture frame on the opposite wall flew off its nail, shattering next to them. The girls shrieked, sprinting out of the room. Susan ran up the stairs, and when she saw her daughter and stepdaughter in a state of absolute genuine hysterics, she realized the truth. The girls were not doing this. They ran out to the car and drove around for hours, simply too terrified to go back inside. When Matt returned home from work, Susan told him everything, but Matt, a hard-headed skeptic who had not witnessed the incidents, refused to believe it. He accused Susan of feeding into the girls' childish imaginations. Another massive, hostile argument erupted between the couple. That night, the entire electrical system in the house went completely dead. Throughout the dark, freezing night, the heavy wooden doors of the house began violently slamming shut and opening on their own. In the kitchen, the electronic ignition on the gas stove began clicking rapidly, over and over, lighting small, terrifying blue flames in the darkness. They huddled in their beds, listening to the relentless, aggressive sounds of their home being torn apart. The next day, Susan, desperate for a solution, confided in a close friend. The friend suggested that the entity in the house might feel threatened by their presence and advised Susan to leave a peace offering to show they meant no harm. Susan, desperate to regain some control, bought into the idea. While Matt was at work, she and the girls gathered in the living room. Susan took a small ceramic figurine of a cat, which was her favorite animal, and placed it in the center of the coffee table, surrounded by lit candles. She spoke aloud, asking the entity to accept the gift and allow them to coexist in peace. Just as they finished the ritual, Matt walked into the house, having left work early due to exhaustion. When he saw the candles and the cat figurine, he became absolutely furious. He screamed that they were acting like lunatics, feeding into a non-existent haunting. He marched over to the table, grabbed the ceramic cat, walked out to the back deck, and violently threw it into the thick brush of the backyard. Susan and the girls began to cry, terrified of the entity's retaliation. They begged Matt to stop. Matt turned around, smugly telling them that he had solved the problem. But when they all looked back at the coffee table, they froze. Sitting in the exact center of the table, perfectly upright, was an identical ceramic cat figurine. It was completely dry and undamaged. Matt, temporarily stunned, quickly shook it off, grabbed the figurine, and violently smashed it onto the hardwood floor, stomping on the pieces. Susan knew they were going to pay a heavy price for his anger. That night, teenage Jamie woke up in the middle of the night feeling hungry. She walked down into the dark kitchen to get a snack. When she turned on the light, she let out a gasp. Written across every single wall, cabinet, and appliance in the kitchen in thick black marker was the word cat, written hundreds of times in a frantic, scratching handwriting. The entire living room had been completely ransacked, with furniture overturned and papers shredded. On the kitchen floor, near the pantry, was a massive wet footprint, far too large to belong to any human. A week later, Marie was home alone at night. As she sat in the living room, the television began rapidly turning off and on. The remote control flew off the coffee table, smashing against the wall. Suddenly, the heavy wooden rocking chair in the corner of the room began to rock back and forth with an incredible, violent speed, as if someone were sitting in it, staring at her. The pictures on the walls began falling one by one. Terrified, Marie grabbed her digital camera and began frantically snapping photos of the empty room before running out of the house. When Susan and Matt reviewed the photos, they saw large, bright, and solid orbs of light hovering in the air around the rocking chair, physical evidence that could not be explained. Matt tried to contact local priests, but after a brief visit, they refused to return, leaving the family to fend for themselves. The final, terrifying climax occurred a few days later when Jamie was home alone. She was in her bedroom when a violent, deafening pounding began on her door, as if a large man were trying to kick it down. She recorded the terrifying sound on her phone, sobbing as the wood bent under the pressure. When the pounding finally stopped, she cautiously opened the door. The hallway was covered in heavy metal pots, frying pans, and sharp knives from the kitchen. The heavy metal door handle of her bedroom was bent completely downward, and a deep, violent dent was left in the wood. Suddenly, Jamie noticed the light in the adjacent bathroom was flickering rapidly. Sensing the entity was inside, she grabbed a thick cord of nylon string from her desk, looped it through the doorknob hole, and pulled the door tightly shut, attempting to trap the entity inside. Instantly, she felt a massive, unnatural force pull back on the other side of the door. The tension was so great that the nylon string was instantly sliced in half, throwing Jamie onto the floor. The bathroom door violently swung open. Before Jamie could even stand, her bedroom door slammed shut, and she heard the frantic clinking of metal utensils outside. A minute later, thick black smoke began pouring under her door. She opened the door and found a metal frying pan sitting in the hallway containing a roll of toilet paper that had been set completely on fire. Trails of toilet paper had been laid out across the entire second floor like a fuse leading to the stairs. The entity was physically attempting to burn the house down with her trapped inside. Jamie smothered the flames with her sweatshirt, ran down the stairs, and sprinted out of the house. She sat on the front steps, shaking and crying until the rest of the family returned. When Susan and Matt saw the scorched hallway and the elaborate attempt to burn the house down, they knew they could not stay another second. The entity was no longer just playing pranks. It was actively trying to murder them. Despite the devastating financial consequences, Susan and Matt abandoned the house, officially declaring bankruptcy. The beautiful home sat vacant, unable to be sold. Shortly after they left, 5 neighboring families in the immediate area also abandoned their homes, leaving the entire suburban block completely empty and silent to this day. Susan, Jamie, Matt, and Marie moved into a modest apartment, and though they lost everything they owned, the terrifying activity completely ceased, leaving them with their lives, but forever changed by the dark terror that had invaded their sanctuary. The wilderness and the quiet places of the world can be incredibly beautiful, but they also hold a vast, silent power that can swallow a human being in the blink of an eye. In October of 2018, on the very same day that filmmaker Terrence Woods went missing in the rugged backwoods of Idaho, a separate, equally baffling disappearance took place just 56 miles away in the very same mountain range. Connie Johnson was an incredible 76-year-old woman who was an outdoors woman through and through. Connie was not a typical senior citizen. She was a highly trained, deeply experienced survivalist who had spent decades living and working in the wild. She had previously served as a professional wilderness ranger for the United States Forest Service. And she was widely known for taking groups of young people deep into the backcountry to teach them how to navigate, find food, and survive in the harshest environments. Her friends and family said she possessed phenomenal survival skills and was completely at home in the deepest, most isolated parts of the forest, often spending weeks completely alone in the wilderness. At the time of her disappearance, Connie was working as a professional camp cook for Ritchie Outfitters, a prominent company that organized guided hunting trips deep into the rugged backcountry of Idaho and Montana. The specific base camp where Connie was stationed was incredibly remote, completely inaccessible by any motorized vehicles. The only way to reach the camp was a long, arduous journey on foot or on horseback through miles of dense, trackless pine forest. On October 2, 2018, all of the hunters and guides of the Ritchie Outfitters camp packed up their gear and left the base camp for a planned 3-day hunting excursion deeper into the mountains. They said goodbye to Connie and her loyal companion, a large dog named Ace. Connie was left completely alone to manage the camp, cook meals, and wait for their return. It was a routine assignment that Connie had performed successfully dozens of times before. The following day, October 3, one of the hunting guides decided to check in on the camp using their long-range radio. They initiated a transmission, and Connie's voice came through the speaker. But the transmission was incredibly strange and deeply unsettling. Connie's voice was garbled, low, and she seemed to be mumbling incoherently. The hunters could not make out a single distinct word she was saying. They tried to ask her to repeat herself, but the signal became increasingly weak and distorted. Because radio interference was relatively common in the deep mountain valleys, the hunters assumed it was simply a bad connection and figured she was perfectly fine. On October 5th, the hunting party finally returned to the base camp expecting to be greeted by the warm smell of Connie's cooking. But as they rode into the clearing, they were met with a silent, empty camp. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, and there was no sign of Connie or her dog Ace. The hunters began searching the camp, and they quickly located a scene that made their blood run cold. Sitting on a wooden picnic table in the center of the camp was Connie's heavy hunting rifle. Draped neatly over the top of the rifle was her warm winter jacket. Her keys, wallet, and all of her personal survival gear were still sitting inside her tent. As a highly experienced wilderness ranger, Connie knew that leaving camp in the rugged, predator-filled Idaho backcountry without her rifle, her jacket, and her basic survival gear was a literal death sentence. She would never have done so voluntarily. The hunters immediately contacted the authorities, and a massive, highly coordinated search and rescue operation was launched. The search was incredibly intense, utilizing advanced helicopters from the National Guard and the Air Force, highly trained search dog teams, thermal imaging drones, and hundreds of experienced ground searchers. They combed every single square inch of the dense forest surrounding the camp. But they found absolutely nothing. There were no footprints, no traces of blood, and no signs of a struggle. On October 16, after nearly 2 weeks of searching in freezing temperatures, the authorities were forced to call off the active search. 3 weeks after Connie and her dog had vanished into thin air, a group of hikers was exploring a remote area of the forest over 15 miles away from the Ritchie Outfitters camp. Suddenly, a thin, emaciated dog emerged from the thick brush, wagging its tail. It was Ace, Connie's dog. The dog was severely malnourished and weak, but otherwise completely uninjured. The search teams were immediately redeployed, hoping to use the dog's scent and behavior to locate Connie. But to their absolute devastation, the dog was unable to lead them to any sign of its owner. To this day, Connie Johnson has never been found. She simply vanished from her remote camp, leaving behind her rifle and her jacket on the exact same day that Terrence Woods sprinted into the same forest, just miles away. These cases remain as some of the most chilling, unexplained anomalies in the history of true crime and wilderness disappearances. They challenge our understanding of reality, leaving us to wonder what truly lies hidden in the dark, silent corners of our world, waiting for us to make a wrong turn. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya!